The lens for astrophotography, architecture, landscapes, interiors and concerts. Today we are out and about for 2 hours in Frankfurt to test the Sigma 14mm 1.4 on my Sony Alpha 7 IV. If you like this test, you can find the lens, camera, memory card or accessories at the link in the video description or at your local dealer. Sigma had already launched a 14mm 1.8 on the market more than 10 years ago. Side by side we can see that both lenses are roughly the same size. The new edition is a little bit wider but also has more features. In addition to a focus lock switch, for example, an aperture control ring has been added, which I can adjust steplessly via a switch on the side. The lens hood is fixed and the body weighs 1160 grams, but it comes with a tripod mount, and if you want to use a filter, it gets quite tough. In addition to an aperture control ring, we can adjust the focus manually at any time using the very soft focus ring. With a close focusing distance of just 30 centimeters and an angle of view of 114 degrees, but more on that in a moment. One reason for such a super wide angle lens is for interior shots, for example, or for weddings, architecture or nature. Which brings us to the next topic, architecture. We were out and in the city center of Frankfurt, where there is currently a lot of construction going on, and I had this 14mm with me on my Sony Alpha 7 IV. One thing that distinguished this lens from my previous wide-angle lenses is that the edges appear very straight and no longer fall so extremely into the background, for example on tall buildings. One big disadvantage about super wide-angle lenses is that the buildings tend to fall in the background, also the edges. Not with this super wide-angle lens. As you can see, this building seems to be really straight, so as this one, and you can see that also on this one here, that the edges don't fall in the background. Nice job, Sigma. Despite the 35mm sensor of my Sony Alpha 7 IV, I still get a crop factor of 1.5 in 4K 50 and 60 frames per second. You should definitely keep that in mind if you plan to film with it and absolutely want to shoot at 50 and 60 frames per second. The autofocus was surprisingly good, whether in photo or in video mode. The face and eye tracking was very precise, even if I had to say that it would play a subordinate role for me. Why? Because I would not primarily use this lens as a portrait lens, for instance, and need a fast tracking, but would rather use a large focus field, for instance, for landscapes or interiors. But details are looking really nice on this lens with a minimum focusing distance of just 30 centimeters. Thanks to the 1.8 aperture, I completely isolate the fore from the background or vice versa, depending obviously on the focus field, which I set either in the fore or the background. A big disadvantage of the super wide angle lens is of course its weight. The 14mm 1.8 G Master could be a real alternative here. Significantly smaller, lighter and also somewhat cheaper. If weight and space are not an issue and you want to take a faster lens with you, for instance on your next vacation or a city trip, then get the Sigma lens. If you don't have a gimbal with you, you can still take reasonably steady shots. The best way to stabilize it is via Premiere Pro or Final Cut in post. With a gimbal, you should always make sure that the center of gravity can be balanced towards the front, as it is relatively front heavy. We find the background blur extremely beautiful at 1.4. The 11 aperture blades ensure round bokeh balls. The 1.4 aperture is also of course not only good for focusing on details, but also for taking photos in the dark. Unfortunately, with all the light pollution, you won't see a lot of stars in Frankfurt, but there should be also plenty of videos and photos online already. If you're out in the dark, here is one lens where you don't need to push the ISO too far. One of the coolest things about this lens is its fast aperture of 1.4. That means you can blur out the background completely so you don't see any faces in the background while you're sharp, and the autofocus is super nice, by the way. It tracks my faces at all times. I see that here on the screen. However, on a small camera like this Sony Alpha 7 IV, it gets super heavy after a minute. But the colors, they look really nice. And it looks so natural, really cool. But keep in mind, on this camera, it crops in by 1.5 if you shoot yourself in 4K 50 and 60. Our conclusion on the 14mm 1.4, apart from the weight, it's a really nice lens. The photos are sharp, the autofocus is fast, the vignetting is very pronounced, but thanks to Adobe Lightroom it can be solved in just a few seconds. We think it's nice to have that tripod clamp included. The manual focus ring is really smooth, so is the aperture control ring, so it's a perfect lens for filming. If you have this lens yourself, please make sure to give your feedback and thoughts about it under this video. And if you would like to have this lens, you will find it in the video description below. If you do have any further questions on this lens or any other lens, please make sure to leave a comment below, make sure to subscribe, thumbs up, and see you next time.